and their central banks into a commitment that would prevent them from printing money with reckless abandon. The gold standard prevented such monetary shenanigans because those who engaged in institutional commerce based on the currency would start to demand gold convertibility, and if more paper IOUs were circulating than could be redeemed, the country's currency would plunge into the value, and its access to international markets would collapse along with it. The carnage, distribution, and fiscal consequences of World War I brought the gold standard screeching to a halt. Post-war central banks fought mightily and at first successfully to restore a version of it, but that failed during the Great Depression. Post-World War II countries sought to restore it again with less devastating consequences, but that effort ultimately and finally failed. In 1973, the U.S. dollar has been a fiat currency ever since. The result that the Federal Reserve banks couldn't print money to fund themselves, or the Federal Reserve Board in 1913, but the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System in 1973 could and did. The real bills doctrine is the final example of the limitations on the Fed's funding apparatus to understand how it functioned. We need to know more about the practices of commercial banking at the time the Fed was founded. As Meltzer described it, the main business of a banker during the late 19th century consisted in issuing notes and discounting bills of exchange. Scholars trace the emergence of the bill of exchange to the 13th century. Although there is evidence of an analog in the Roman Empire, this discounting function was a kind of a loan. A standard loan involves two parties, the lender and the borrower, who agree on the amount of money loaned. The cost of that loan, that is, the interest rate, and the terms of that loan, the debtor and creditor become involved in each other's affairs during the life of that loan until the borrowed money is repaid. Then and now, a two-way loan is limited by how much the lender knows about the borrower. It also requires geographic proximity. A bill of exchange is the answer for these limitations. A bill is a financing mechanism that involves four parties, not two, and is essential for the facilitation of new ways of doing business and new types of commerce. At the time of the Fed's first founding, the primary businesses were across the vast stretches of the United States to facilitate bringing agricultural products to market and hopes of participating in a dollar-denominated international trading system. In either case, the four parties are the exporter and the importer of specified goods, and the two corresponding banks at either end of that transaction. For example, if I want to sell some coffee in New York and know a coffee farmer in Brazil, we might finance the shipment with a bill of exchange. I would sign it, the Brazilian coffee farmer would sign it, and so would our two banks. With this bill of exchange, the farmer's bank is lending money to me through my bank by providing the farmer with the money up front that I promise to pay back after I receive the coffee and sell it to my customers. The bill of exchange itself is a letter from one merchant to another that requests funds on behalf of the importer to be paid to the exporter in the exporter's currency at a specified date. The bill is then discounted by the banks, meaning that they will provide less than the full value of the transaction so that they can reap a profit. If I promise to pay my Brazilian business partner $1 million, the bank may provide $900,000 at a discount of 10%. The confusing terminology of the discount rate may be one consequence of the Catholic Church's prohibition on usury during the medieval era. The discount rate is just an interest rate by another name, but certain kinds of interest, quotes, was prohibited by the church during this period. Instead, the bills of exchange were discounted, quotes, meaning the importer would pay the corresponding bank more than the face of the bill in order to compensate the bank for its provision of the short-term loan. A discount, quotes, and an interest rate are economically identical, but the vocabulary difference was apparently sufficient to pass muster with theologians. A bill of exchange thus resolves the quintessential problem of international trade. Who gets paid first? The provider of the goods transported, or the one who will sell those goods at the other end? Of the transport. A bill of exchange makes the payment instantaneous to the exporter, but not payable by the importer until the funds are realized by the sale of the goods in question against as a four-way transaction. Bill of exchange are relatively old. What is newer is their negotiability. That is, the four transacting parties in the bill of exchange can quickly multiply almost indefinitely, as if the importers promise to pay a fixed amount on a fixed date, were transferable or negotiable to another party. In that case, another party would pay the corresponding bank some amount less than the face value and the collect amount of the bill from the importer when it became due. When the Fed was founded in 1913, commercial banks actively engaged in the discounting of commercial paper. What was different about the central bank's engagement in this business was the volume of discounting that could be done, on whose behalf and with what relationship to the banking system, generally private discounting of commercial paper, including bills of exchange, is a profit-generating exercise that can be necessarily laborious and costly. The cost of validating the credit of the importer, the one who has to most ultimately pay off the bill at the due date, is high, perhaps insurmountably so. If the secondary discounter has to know about the importer's business, creditworthiness, and so on, if on the other hand the counterparty is a single institution backed in part or in full by trustworthy government, then the transaction cost of the secondary discount is reduced only to the cost of verifying the creditworthiness of the single institution. That was the benefit of a central bank at the turn of the 20th century. But a key part of the debate was exactly what kinds of bills could be discounted. Under the doctrine not called by the real bills doctrine until 1945, the only bills that could be discounted were those that represented an actual transaction that had already occurred and would be paid off in the short order. The funding of speculative bills was the alternative of those transactions that had not yet occurred and may never occur. My bill for $1 million that pointed to the amount of coffee I had already bought at the boat would bring it to Rio de Janeiro to New York City was real. Some other coffee enthusiast IOU for paying back loan that I promised to use find some coffee down in Brazil is speculative. The real bills of doctrine endorsed by Bagot is an essential to the functioning of a proper central bank. Meant that central banks would discount my bill, but not that of other coffee enthusiasts. This view of the world was placed directly into the Federal Reserve Act, which required that a Federal Reserve Bank may discount notes, drafts, and bills of exchange arising out of actual commercial transactions, excluding notes, drafts, or bills covering merely investments or issued or drawn for the purpose of carrying or trading in stocks, bonds, or other investment securities. Economically, the real bills of doctrines didn't work very well. As Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz wrote, the real bills criterion provided no effective limit to the amount of money. This is because of the inherent difficulty determining what counts as a real bill, quotes, that a reserve bank can permissibly discount. This uncertainty led to different interpretations and different economic consequences. The point is that even if the real bills doctrine didn't present an objective limitation in practice at the time of the 1913 debates, both it and the gold standard were seen as an essential to the Federal Reserve Act's legitimacy. The claim that the new Federal Reserve notes would represent fiat money, quotes, were fighting words. Yeah, fighting words. The colorful carded Glass's defense on the House floor against the charge is quotable at length. Fiat money. Why, sir? Never since the world began was there such a perversion of terms. And a month ago I stood before a brilliant audience of 700 bankers and businessmen in New York City, and there challenged the president of National City Bank to name a single lexicographer on the face of the earth to whom he might appeal to justify his characterization of these notes. I twitted him with the fact that not 1% of the intelligent bankers of America could be induced to agree with his definition of these notes, and asked him to name a single financial writer of the metropolitan press of his own town to whom he might confidently appeal to justify his absurd charge. Fiat money is an irredeemable paper with no specie basis, with no gold reserve, but the value of which depends solely upon taxing power of the governing it. The Federal Reserve note has 40% gold reserve behind it, has 1% short-term gilt-edged commercial paper behind it, which must pass the scrutiny first of the individual bank, next the regional reserve bank, and finally of the Reserve Board, the Federal Reserve Board. For that reason, although the lack of clear statutory authorization for its extraordinary budgetary autonomy may be troubling, the removal of that autonomy would effectively be the end of monetary policy outside the halls of Congress. In an ideal world, the Fed would have the clear congressional authorization needed to justify its current practices, but the legislation politics of Fed reform don't operate in a perfect world. Opening the Federal Reserve Act on this technical question may only invite mayhem, given the transparency of the Fed's budgetary process and the frequency with which members of Congress like Wright-Patman sought to change the practice. We can assume that Congress has essentially conceded the practice. Arguments about how the Fed interacts with the money supply tend to provoke spirited arguments. To put it mildly, in light thereof, one final point should be emphasized. There is nothing more secretive or nefarious about the Fed's use of open market operations to fund itself. The Fed includes its accounting of its open market operations in its annual reports, and has done so with varying degrees of transparency for its entire 100-year history. One of the reasons so many scholars and central bankers have misidentified the statutory basis of the Fed's funding because the Fed is so transparent about its funds itself. Moreover, the Fed has in a century under intense scrutiny. Market participants and angry critics alike had no major financial scandal. This is an impressive feat for any agency, let alone one that generates as much controversy as the Fed. For example, Ben Bernanke, even when he flew so far over conferences in remote towns in South Korea or in the far-off Arctic, still flew commercial. Rather than an expose, the point of the analysis is to explain the way that Congress created a specific set of fiscal relationships within the Federal Reserve System that no longer exist, or our understanding of the power and independence of the Federal Reserve requires an exploration of the basis for its exercise of this central authority. The point is one of the main arguments in the book. Legal institutions, even when carefully laid, can shift dramatically over time. Conclusion: Congress and the Fed. Remember Ben Bernanke advice to Janet Yellen about Congress? Bernanke was legally correct. Congress made the Federal Reserve, and Congress can unmake the Federal Reserve. More broadly, of course, this book has argued that the Congress is not the only influence on the Fed policy. Even as it is the author of the missions placed before it. Even the narrow question of how the Congress influences Fed decisions is important to place in context. The more powerful authority Congress has is arguably the power of the purse. But in the respect Congress has ceded authority to the Fed, giving the central bank the most important element of its separation from congressional control. The life of the Fed's budgetary autonomy demonstrates the ways that even relatively narrow, tailored legal institutional arguments can be undercut through changes in political and financial arguments. But because these changes happen in a transparent way, they only demonstrate how much non-legal mechanisms can change institutions. As we could see in the examples of the Wright-Patman and Henry Gonzalez, members of Congress can also influence the Fed through the threat of legislative action. Fed history is filled with such examples. It can influence central banking policy outside of their legal authority. Law may tie the political Ulysses to the mast, but only loosely. Other ties come from other sources where those ties exist at all. Chapter 10, the Fed. The communities of the Federal Reserve, but nevertheless, the objection which is urged against English bankers is at least equally applicable to these foreign bankers. They have or may have, at certain periods, an interest opposite to the bank policy of the bank. Walter Bagot, 1873. The central assumption of the Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Fed independence is one of technocracy. There are objectively correct answers to problems of monetary policy. The political interests in a democracy will get wrong. Remove monetary policy decision-making from the political process and place it in the hands of the technocratic chaperone. The technocrat will reach that objectively correct answer, but expertise has a political logic all its own. In this chapter, we will explore the source of some of that logic by looking at how the members of their communities, markets, international central bankers, and academic economists seek to influence how technocratic expertise is deployed. It is interplay with these other outsiders that illustrates that tension in the institutional design of the Fed is not only between political accountability and technocratic expertise. There is an important component at play in the Fed policy making to reflect the experiences, values, and worldviews in a world that ideologies of the central bankers inside the Fed. There is Humpty Dumpty danger invoking the loaded term ideology, quotes, a word that can mean whatever its speaker wants it to mean. But as the term is used here, arguing the Fed policy makers are ideologically influenced by ideology is not to impugn their motives or accuse them of dogmatic partnership. Instead, following political theorist Herbert McCloskey, ideologies are systems of belief that are elaborate, integrated, and coherent, that justify the exercise of power, explain the judge of historical events, identify political right and wrong, set forth the interconnections, casual and moral, between politics and other spheres of activity. Everyone has ideologies. Fed policy makes are no different. In this chapter, the effort will be to understand how ideologies of outsiders inform the Fed policy making space. The way that each of these three groups addressed in this chapter, private bankers, international central bankers, and economists, influence Fed policy could receive their own chapters, even their own books. In this treatment, though, they are not equal actors. This chapter puts the most emphasis on ideological influence that private market participants, especially regulated bankers, have on shaping Fed policy. The emphasis is justified because one of the most problematic aspects of democratic governance in designing the policies of the central bank, especially with respect to regulating and supervising the financial system, an advantage goes to those who are closest. legally, intellectually, culturally, and socially to the central bankers. Private bankers aren't necessarily closer in this respect than international central bankers or economists. We care more about the bankers because the regulation and supervision of international central banks and academic economists is necessarily less important from the perspective of democratic governance. For that reason, private bankers receive primary attention in the pages ahead. Banker influence, suasion, and capture, and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. How then do private bankers influence the space within the Fed operates? Question. We have already seen in Chapter 5 one key aspect of the Fed's legal proximity. The governments of the Federal Reserve banks, but the legal structure. You need one of these when you're reading. Just click that motherfucking page. The Fed's policy makers and private market participants are together in more ways than this, with important implications for the Fed exercises its power. Most people are relatively untroubled by private influences on the, say, the Federal Reserve banks in Cleveland or Minneapolis. Fuck. The New York focus is appropriate. The New York Fed is the primary banking regulator of the nation's largest financial institutions. The bank supervisory and regulatory work matters are not just the health of the institutions they oversee, but also the health of the entire financial system and indeed the entire economy. Focusing on the New York Fed, for example, reveals an important aspect of the Fed's proximity. To the banks it regulates. There are social benefits to this proximity. The New York Fed's unique relationship to the banks and even market participants over whom the Fed has no legal claim, whatever allows it to engage productively in what this chapter calls regulatory suasion. Quotes, regulatory suasion refers to the regulator's ability to direct private activity without using no coercion, government authority. In this way, the reserve banks, and especially the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, act more as a coordinator of private actors rather than as a public regulator. In this ability to persuade, that also exposes the New York Fed's primary weakness. In working so closely with the banks that regulates to find pockets of risk that harm them, the New York Fed adopts the ideologies of commercial banks. They can become, in the academic parlance, captured. Suasion and capture them, then, are two sides of the same coin. Suasion, hedge funds, and derivatives. Two cases from recent history put these dynamics on full display. First, the resolution of what might have been an extraordinarily U.S. financial crisis in the late 1990s, the collapse of the hedge fund long-term capital management, LTCM, in parentheses. Second, the 2007 intervention to improve the process by which financial firms cleared their trades on complex financial contracts, including some of the derivatives at the heart of the financial crisis of 2007 through 2009. It just says 2007-9. We'll address each in turn. Long-term capital management was the king of hedge funds, a firm built on Nobel Prize winning ideas by genius economists and traders who made a systematic bet that the markets are efficient in the medium term but roiling with inefficiencies in the short term. The basic idea of the firm was hedged arbitrage, I don't know how to pronounce that shit, a common Wall Street trading strategy whereby price discrepancies between two similar assets are identified and exploited for profit. An arbitrator, will buy the chapter of two assets and sell or short. The more expensive assets, if the price is coverage, the arbitrator makes a tidy profit. There are two tricks of making the profit, something more than just picking up pennies and nickels. First, the trader has to have the correct theory of the misplaced assets. The second, the trader has to borrow as much money as possible to finance the trade on profitable terms. Borrowed money amplifies the return on exploiting price differences that would otherwise be much smaller. The first prong is difficult in part because it is hard to come up with good predictive theories of mispriced assets. But even with the right theory, it is difficult to be in sync with the operations of markets, such that the others in market come to the same conclusion. Early enough in the trade of the arbitrator, that motherfucking arbitrator, alright, to make a profit, as the saying goes, often but probably falsely attributed to John Maynard Keynes, the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. Why the arbitrator? Because that motherfucker needs to add leverage to the mix. The trader's solvency can become even more fragile. A very simplified numerical example is helpful here. Suppose I have my eye on two stocks issued by companies that my arbitrage model tells me are essentially identical. For whatever reason, the markets aren't treating them the same. One is trading them at $90 a share, the other for $100 a share. If my arbitrage model is right that these two companies are essentially identical, then all I need to do is buy the $90 share, sell the $100 share, and wait for the two prices to converge. If they converge at $95, I made a quick $10. Dash 5, $10 to $5. That must be the average mean on the stock that went up, and $5 on the stock that went down. I'm ignoring the cost of actually making the trade for this explanation. If I put up the $90, remember I borrowed the $100 share. Quotes. I've made an 11% return on my money. That's pretty good trade. But suppose I only made $10. I was willing to devote to this trade, so I had to borrow the rest to pull it off. My first step would be to find someone to lend me another $80. Suppose I find someone to lend me at 5%. So I'd have to pay back $84 when the trade is done. Then after prices converge, I'm sitting on $5 from the shortest stock and $95 on the stock whose value just went up, for a total of $100. After I paid that back to my lender for the $84, I've made $16. The $10 I started with plus $6 more in exactly the same trade, I nearly sextupled. Watch out for that word, sextupled. My return 60% instead of 11%. If we multiply these figures by $1 billion, a few $1 billion, then we enter the world of long-term capital management. From stocks listed in two countries to similarities situated European debt to two kinds of mortgage-backed securities. The traders at the firm borrowed as much money from as many different banks as possible and laughed. They fucking laughed their way to their wealth. As their returns exploded in the first year, they returned 21% on their capital. The next year, 43%. The year after, 41%. Even in the I say heydays, but it says heady days of the late 1990s, these were extraordinary returns. Then it all came crashing down. The reality about leverage arbitrage, fuck pronouncing that word, I'll get it someday, is that when the trade goes your way, you are buried in riches. When the trade doesn't go your way, you are buried in debt. In the period of a few short months in 1998, the hedge fund that could do no wrong started hemorrhaging. That means bleeding out. Billions of dollars. Their model said that the assets they were trying to arbitrage, they were sure to merge in price. Those models might have been exactly right in the general conditions, but the financial crisis of Southeast Asia and Russia caused so much confusion in the financial markets that they hoped for the convergencies stayed out of their reach. The firm's managers knew they needed to resolve the problem. They tried. They called Warren Buffett and sought their first loan, offered them an entire firm to the Oracle of Omaha, but he balked at their terms. They balked at this. They called George Soros, same result. They called all the banker counterparties to seek relief from their debts, and proving the adage that the banker is the one who lends an umbrella on a sunny day, but demands it back at the first sight of rain. These banker counterparties, who were too eager to funnel money into the firm when it was profitable, now demanded immediate payment with interest. That's a guarantee. Here is where the New York Fed comes into the picture. For not altogether obvious reason, the New York Fed is not the supervisor of hedge funds. It supervises banks that belong to Federal Reserve systems. Bank holding companies and a few others, it didn't have any regulatory relationship with hedge funds. But the New York Fed has never limited itself to formal niceties of the market actors. As Roger Lowenstein wrote in Practice, the New York Fed routinely talked to traders at hedge funds, some of whom freely shared their opinions on the market and all of whom tactically recognized the Fed's authority. Alright. If I put it... Shit. After sending the head of his trading desk to analyze